Bushido, Soul of Japan, translated by The Rising Word. Chapter 1. Bushido as an Ethical System. Chivalry is as deeply rooted in Japanese culture as the cherry blossom, our national symbol. It is not merely a dried relic of an ancient virtue preserved in the annals of history. Rather, it remains a living force, full of power and beauty, that continues to inspire and influence us. Although it lacks a tangible form, its essence fills our moral atmosphere, making us acutely aware of its enduring presence. The societal conditions that once gave birth to and nurtured Bushido have long since disappeared. Yet, just as the light of distant stars, extinguished long ago, still reaches us, so too does the spirit of chivalry, born of feudalism, continue to illuminate our ethical paths. It endures even though the feudal system that gave rise to it has passed away. I find it a privilege to reflect on this subject in the words of Edmund Burke, whose famous eulogy mourned the neglected bier of Europe's own chivalric tradition. It is a striking deficiency in knowledge about the Far East that such a learned scholar as Dr. George Miller once claimed that chivalry, or any similar institution, never existed among the nations of antiquity or the modern Orient. However, this misunderstanding is forgivable, considering that the third edition of Dr. Miller's work was published the same year that Commodore Perry first arrived to challenge Japan's long-standing isolation. More than a decade later, as Japan's feudal system approached its final days, Karl Marx, writing in his Capital, urged his readers to study Japan as a living example of feudalism's social and political institutions. Similarly, I encourage Western historians and ethicists to examine the enduring legacy of chivalry in modern Japan. While it is tempting to delve into a detailed historical comparison between European and Japanese feudalism and chivalry, that is not the aim of this discussion. Instead, I seek to explore four key aspects of Japanese chivalry, or Bushido. First, its origins and sources. Second, its character and teachings. Third, its influence on the broader population. And fourth, the continuity and permanence of its legacy. Of these, the first will be addressed briefly, as a full explanation would require a deep dive into the complexities of our national history. The second will receive more attention, as it is likely to resonate with those studying international ethics and comparative cultural behaviors. The remaining points will follow naturally as extensions of this discussion. The Japanese term I have loosely translated as chivalry is, in its original form, more nuanced than simply horsemanship. Bushido, literally translated as military knightways, refers to the principles and behaviors that samurai, the warrior nobility, were expected to uphold in both their professional and personal lives. In essence, it embodies the precepts of knighthood, comparable to the concept of noblesse oblige for the warrior class. Having explained its literal meaning, I will continue to use the term Bushido throughout, as it better conveys the uniqueness of this code. This choice is further justified because Bushido represents a philosophy so distinct and deeply rooted in Japanese culture that its essence cannot be fully captured by a direct translation. Certain words carry a cultural resonance that transcends linguistic boundaries, and any attempt to translate them risks diminishing their meaning. For instance, how can one improve upon the German term Gemüt, or fail to appreciate the subtle differences between the English gentleman and the French gentilhomme? These terms, though similar in definition, evoke distinct cultural identities. Bushido is the code of moral principles that samurai were expected to follow. It is not a formal, written code. At most, it consists of a handful of maxims passed down orally or written by renowned warriors or scholars. More often, it is an unwritten and unspoken code, all the more powerful because it was upheld through actions and ingrained in the hearts of its adherents. It was not the product of one brilliant mind or the legacy of a single individual, no matter how famous. Instead, it evolved organically over decades and centuries of military life. In the history of ethics, Bushido occupies a place similar to that of the English Constitution in political history. However, unlike the Constitution, it lacks any formal documents like the Magna Carta or the Habeas Corpus Act. While some military statutes, buke hato, were issued in the early 17th century, their 13 brief articles focus primarily on matters like marriage, castles, and alliances, offering little in the way of moral instruction. As such, it is impossible to pinpoint a specific time or place as the origin of Bushido. Its development is closely tied to Japan's feudal era, and its beginnings can be traced to the rise of feudalism itself. Like feudalism in England, which formally began with the Norman conquest, Japan's feudal system emerged with the ascendancy of Minamoto no Yoritomo in the late 12th century. However, just as the social roots of feudalism in England predate William the Conqueror, the seeds of Japanese feudalism, and by extension Bushido, existed long before Yoritomo's time. In Japan, as in Europe, the formal establishment of feudalism brought the professional warrior class into prominence. These warriors were known as samurai, a term that literally means guards or attendants, much like the Old English word knight, knight. Their role and character resembled the solduri mentioned by Caesar in Aquitania, the comitati described by Tacitus in ancient Germanic tribes, or the milites medi of medieval Europe. Another commonly used term for these warriors was buke or bushi, meaning fighting knights. Originally, the samurai were a privileged yet rough and rugged class who made warfare their livelihood. During Japan's long periods of conflict, this class naturally drew from the bravest and most adventurous individuals, with the weaker and less courageous being gradually weeded out. Over time, only a rude race, all masculine with brutish strength, as Emerson would put it, remained to establish families and form the core of the samurai ranks. As the samurai class grew in prominence, they gained great honor, privileges, and responsibilities. With these came the need for a shared standard of behavior. This was particularly important because they were often at odds with members of other clans and perpetually in a state of readiness for war. Just as physicians establish professional courtesy and lawyers resolve disputes through courts of honor, warriors, too, required a system to arbitrate misconduct and uphold fair play in battle. Fair play in fight. This primitive notion of justice contains the seeds of morality. Is it not the foundation of both military and civic virtue? We might smile at the youthful idealism of the fictional Tom Brown, who wished to leave behind him the name of a fellow who never bullied a little boy or turned his back on a big one. Yet who can deny that this simple aspiration is the cornerstone of towering moral principles? Even the gentlest and most peace-loving religions endorse this sentiment as it forms the basis of integrity and strength. This desire for fair play and honor is not only the foundation of England's greatness, but also central to the spirit of Bushido. While the act of fighting, whether offensive or defensive, may indeed be brutal and wrong, as Quakers rightly assert, we can echo Lessing in observing that we know from what failings our virtue springs. To healthy and straightforward minds, cowardice and deceit are among the gravest insults. Both childhood and knighthood begin with these principles, and as life grows more complex, these early values seek higher moral justification and refinement. Without such moral support, the ideal of knighthood would have fallen far short of true chivalry. In Europe, Christianity, though often interpreted in ways that accommodated the needs of chivalry, infused it with spiritual depth. As Lamartine observed, religion, war, and glory were the three souls of a perfect Christian knight. Similarly, Bushido in Japan drew its strength and character from several distinct sources. Chapter 2. Sources of Bushido. Let us begin with Buddhism. It provided the samurai with a deep sense of calm trust in fate, an acceptance of the inevitable, and a stoic composure in the face of danger or calamity. Buddhism also nurtured a disdain for life's transience and a close familiarity with death. One renowned teacher of swordsmanship, after witnessing his pupil achieve mastery, declared, "Beyond this point, my teaching must yield to Zen." Zen, the Japanese term for dhyana, represents the human effort to reach, through meditation, levels of understanding beyond the limits of words. Its practice centers on contemplation, and its ultimate goal is to perceive the underlying principle of all phenomena, or even the absolute itself, and to align oneself with it. This teaching transcends the confines of sectarian dogma. Anyone who achieves this perception of the absolute rises above worldly concerns and awakens to what might be called a new heaven and a new earth. What Buddhism did not provide, Shintoism supplied in abundance. Shinto teachings instilled a profound sense of loyalty to the sovereign, reverence for ancestral memory, and filial piety, qualities unmatched by any other creed. These principles tempered the otherwise bold and assertive character of the samurai, bringing balance and humility. Unlike religions that emphasize the concept of original sin, Shintoism celebrates the innate goodness and divine purity of the human soul. It views the heart as a sacred space where divine truth is revealed. This belief is symbolized by the plain mirror found in Shinto shrines, the central element of their minimalist design. The mirror represents the human heart. When calm and clear, it reflects the image of the divine. Thus, when worshippers stand before the shrine and see their reflection in the mirror, the act of worship aligns with the ancient Delphic maxim, "Know thyself." However, self-knowledge in Shinto and Greek philosophy does not focus on physical or psychological aspects. Instead, it emphasizes moral introspection, the awareness of one's ethical nature. Historian Theodore Mommsen, comparing Greek and Roman religious practices, noted that Greeks raised their eyes to heaven in prayer as an act of contemplation, while Romans covered their heads, engaging in reflection. Similarly, in Japan, Shinto practices highlight not only individual moral reflection, but also a sense of national consciousness. Nature worship, a key component of Shintoism, fostered a deep love for the land. Ancestor worship, with its unbroken lineage, tied every individual to the imperial family, the symbolic source of the nation. To the Japanese, the land is more than just a resource for gold or grain. It is the sacred home of the gods and the spirits of their forebears. The emperor, likewise, is not merely a constitutional figurehead or a patron of culture. He is the earthly embodiment of divine power and mercy, heaven's representative on earth. As Monsieur Boutmy observed of English royalty, it serves as not only the image of authority, but the author and symbol of national unity. This sentiment is even more profoundly true of Japanese royalty, which embodies both the spiritual and national identity of the people. The principles of Shintoism encompass two dominant aspects of the Japanese emotional life: patriotism and loyalty. Arthur May Knapp aptly noted, "In Hebrew literature, it is often difficult to discern whether the writer is speaking of God or the Commonwealth, of heaven or Jerusalem, of the Messiah or the nation itself." A similar ambiguity can be observed in the language of Japan's national faith. I call it ambiguity because, to a logical mind, it appears verbally imprecise, yet as an expression of national instincts and racial emotions, Shintoism never claimed to be a systematic philosophy or a rational theology. This religion, or perhaps more accurately, the racial emotions it embodies, deeply infused Bushido with an unwavering loyalty to the sovereign and a profound love for the nation. These qualities function more as natural impulses than formal doctrines. Unlike the medieval Christian Church, Shintoism imposed few beliefs, credenda, on its followers, and instead offered straightforward and practical guidelines, agenda. When it comes to strictly ethical teachings, Confucianism was the most influential source of Bushido. Confucius articulated the 5 key moral relationships between ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger siblings, and between friends. These principles were not entirely new to Japan, but rather affirmed instincts already present in the culture before Confucius's writings arrived from China. His calm, benevolent and pragmatic approach to ethical and political matters resonated deeply with the samurai who occupied the ruling class. The aristocratic and conservative tone of his teachings fit well with the needs of these warrior statesmen. In addition to Confucius, the philosopher Mencius had a significant impact on Bushido. His bold and often democratic ideas appealed to those with empathetic and just natures. However, these theories were also seen as potentially destabilizing to the social order, leading to his works being censored for a time. Despite this, the profound insights of Mencius found a permanent home in the hearts of the samurai. The writings of Confucius and Mencius were the primary textbooks for the education of youth and the ultimate authority in intellectual discussions among elders. However, merely possessing an academic knowledge of these classics was not highly regarded. A popular proverb mocked those who were well versed in Confucius but lacked practical understanding, calling them individuals who were always studying but oblivious to the deeper meaning of the Analects. A typical samurai might dismiss a scholarly intellectual as a book-smelling sot. Another comparison likened learning to a foul-smelling vegetable that must be boiled repeatedly before it becomes palatable. The implication was clear. A man who has read only a little is mildly pedantic, while one who has read extensively is even more so. Both are equally unpleasant. The underlying message was that knowledge only becomes valuable when it is truly absorbed and reflected in one's character. An intellectual specialist was often viewed as nothing more than a machine, capable of producing poems and maxims on demand. Intellect itself was considered secondary to ethical emotion and spiritual insight. In the philosophy of Bushido, both humanity and the universe were seen as fundamentally spiritual and ethical entities. Consequently, Bushido could not accept the view espoused by Huxley that the cosmic process is devoid of morality. Knowledge, as understood in Bushido, was not pursued for its own sake, but as a means to achieve wisdom. Those who stopped at mere knowledge without applying it in life were considered no better than tools, useful but lacking depth. In this regard, Bushido echoed the Socratic principle that knowledge must be united with action. This concept found its greatest advocate in the Chinese philosopher Wang Yangming, who repeatedly emphasized, "To know and to act are one and the same." Allow me to briefly digress, as some of the most noble examples of Bushi were profoundly influenced by the teachings of the Chinese philosopher Wang Yangming. Western readers may easily recognize parallels between his writings and passages from the New Testament. For example, the sentiment expressed in "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you," is echoed repeatedly throughout Wang Yangming's philosophy. A Japanese follower of Yangming once wrote, "The Lord of heaven and earth, of all living beings, resides in the heart of man, becoming his mind, kokoro. Therefore, the mind is a living entity and is ever luminous." He also said, "The spiritual light of our essential being is pure and unaffected by human will. It arises spontaneously within our mind, revealing what is right and wrong. This is what we call conscience. It is the light that emanates from the God of heaven. These words bear a striking resemblance to passages from Isaac Pennington or other philosophical mystics. The Japanese mind, shaped by the simplicity of Shinto teachings, seemed particularly receptive to Yang Ming's ideas. His philosophy emphasized the infallibility of conscience, elevating it to a transcendental level. He believed that conscience not only discerns right from wrong, but also perceives the nature of psychological and physical realities. In his idealism, Yang Ming went as far as, if not farther than, thinkers like Berkeley and Fichte, denying the existence of anything beyond human perception. Though his system may contain the logical flaws often attributed to solipsism, it also possessed the power of unwavering conviction. Its moral influence in fostering individuality and equanimity of spirit is undeniable, making it a significant force in shaping the character of Bushido. Regardless of its sources, the core principles of Bushido were few and simple. Yet these principles proved sufficient to guide life through even the most dangerous and chaotic periods of Japanese history. The unrefined yet wholesome nature of our warrior ancestors found ample nourishment for their spirits in a collection of commonplace, fragmentary teachings. These teachings, gathered like scattered grains of wisdom from the highways and byways of ancient thought, were shaped by the demands of the times into a new and distinct ideal of manhood. A sharp French observer, Monsieur de la Mazelière, described his impressions of 16th century Japan as follows. By the mid-16th century, Japan was in complete disarray. Its government, society, and even its religious institutions were in turmoil. Civil wars, a return to barbaric manners, and the necessity for individuals to administer their own justice created men comparable to the Italians of the same period, whom Taine praises for their vigorous initiative, habit of sudden resolutions and desperate undertakings, and grand capacity to act and endure. In Japan, as in Italy, the rough manners of the Middle Ages forged individuals into superb creatures, entirely militant and wholly resilient. This is why the 16th century showcases, in the highest degree, a principal quality of the Japanese people, the remarkable diversity found not only in intellects, but also in temperaments. While in India and even China, individuals seem to differ mostly in energy or intelligence. In Japan, they also differ by the originality of their character. Individuality is the hallmark of advanced races and developed civilizations. To borrow a phrase from Nietzsche, one could say that in Asia humanity is symbolized by its plains, while in Japan and Europe it is represented by its mountains. With these characteristics of the men Monsieur de la Mazelière describes in mind, let us now turn our attention to the virtues that defined them. I shall begin with rectitude. Chapter 3. Rectitude or Justice. Here, we encounter one of the most vital precepts in the code of the samurai, rectitude. Few things were more abhorrent to the samurai than deceitful behavior or dishonest dealings. The concept of rectitude, though it may sometimes be interpreted narrowly or imperfectly, was central to their ethos. One notable Bushi defined rectitude as the strength of determination. Rectitude is the power to choose a course of action in accordance with reason, without hesitation. To die when it is right to die, to strike when it is right to strike. Another likened rectitude to the skeleton that gives a body its structure. Rectitude is the bone that gives firmness and stature. Just as a head cannot rest on the spine, nor hands move, nor feet stand without bones, so without rectitude, neither talent nor learning can shape a human frame into a samurai. With rectitude, the lack of accomplishments is inconsequential. Mencius, the great Chinese philosopher, described benevolence as the mind of humanity and rectitude, or righteousness, as its path. He lamented, How pitiful it is to neglect the path and not follow it, to lose the mind and fail to seek it again. When people lose their chickens or dogs, they know to search for them, but when they lose their mind, they do not know to seek it. Does this not remind us, as if through a darkened mirror, of a parable taught 3 centuries later in another land by a greater teacher who called himself the way of righteousness, the path through which the lost may be found? Yet I digress. According to Mencius, righteousness is a straight and narrow path, one that must be taken to regain the paradise that was lost. Even in the latter days of feudalism, when prolonged peace introduced leisure to the warrior class and brought with it various indulgences and refined arts, the term gishi, meaning a man of rectitude, remained the highest honor. It surpassed any title signifying mastery of learning or art. The 47 ronin, celebrated in Japan's popular education, are commonly known as the 47 gishi. In times when cunning and deceit were often mistaken for military strategy, and outright falsehoods were disguised as clever tactics, ruse de guerre, the virtue of rectitude, frank, honest and unwavering, shone as a rare and treasured jewel. This manly virtue stood out and was held in the highest regard. Rectitude is closely tied to valor, another martial virtue. However, before delving into the subject of valor, I wish to pause and reflect on an offshoot of rectitude, one that, though originally aligned with it, gradually diverged and eventually became distorted in popular understanding. I speak of giri. Giri, translated literally as right reason, initially referred to a pure and unambiguous sense of duty, what we might call duty in its most fundamental form. In its pristine meaning, giri represented the obligations that reason and morality demanded of an individual. Thus, we speak of the giri owed to our parents, superiors, subordinates, and to society at large. In all these cases, giri was synonymous with duty, the innate expectation to act in accordance with what is just and right. For what is duty, if not the command of right reason? Should not right reason itself be regarded as our categorical imperative, guiding our actions without exception or compromise? At its core, giri originally meant no more than duty. Its etymology likely stems from the idea that in our behavior toward others, such as toward our parents, while love should ideally be the sole motivator, when love is absent, another force must compel action. This force was formalized as giri. Rightly so, for when love does not inspire virtuous deeds, intellect and reason must intervene to remind individuals of their moral responsibilities. This principle applies universally to all moral obligations. The moment duty becomes burdensome, right reason steps in to prevent us from abandoning it. In this sense, giri acts as a stern taskmaster, wielding a birch rod to ensure that the unwilling fulfill their obligations. However, as an ethical motivator, giri is secondary and vastly inferior to the Christian principle of love, which should be the ultimate guiding law. Giri, I believe, is a byproduct of an artificial society, a society structured around accidents of birth and unearned privilege, where rigid class distinctions, familial hierarchy, and age-based seniority often overshadowed talent or natural affection. In such a framework, giri often replaced genuine emotional connections, enforcing arbitrary customs and obligations. This artificiality eventually caused giri to degrade into a vague sense of propriety, used to justify or sanction questionable practices. For instance, it was invoked to explain why a mother must sacrifice all her children to save the eldest, or why a daughter might feel obligated to sell her chastity to fund her father's indulgences. What began as right reason, in my view, too often descended into casuistry, turning into a tool for rationalizing behavior. At its worst, giri became a cowardly fear of social censure. As Sir Walter Scott remarked of patriotism, Giri too could be the fairest, yet the most suspicious mask of other feelings. When Giri strayed too far from its original meaning, it became a dangerous misnomer, sheltering all forms of sophistry and hypocrisy. Without the counterbalancing influence of Bushido's emphasis on courage, the spirit of daring and resilience, Giri could easily have degenerated into a haven for cowardice. Chapter 4. Courage, the spirit of daring and bearing. Courage in the samurai ethos was scarcely considered a virtue unless it served the cause of righteousness. In his Analects, Confucius defines courage not by what it is, but by what it is not. To see what is right and not do it is a lack of courage. Restated positively, this becomes, courage is doing what is right. All too often, courage is mistaken for recklessness, facing danger blindly, rushing into peril, or even courting death itself. In the profession of arms, such behavior, what Shakespeare aptly calls valor misbegot, is frequently and unjustly celebrated. However, the precepts of knighthood held a higher standard. Death for an unworthy cause was scorned as a dog's death. As a Prince of Mito observed, "To rush into the thick of battle and perish, there is easy enough. Any lowly churl can manage that." True courage, however, is to live when it is right to live, and to die only when it is right to die. Remarkably, the prince had never encountered Plato's writings, yet his understanding echoes Plato's definition of courage as the knowledge of what should be feared and what should not be feared. The distinction between moral courage and physical courage, often discussed in Western thought, has long been recognized in the samurai tradition. Every samurai youth is familiar with the concepts of great valor and the valor of a villain. Valor, fortitude, bravery, fearlessness, and courage, these qualities of the soul, naturally captivate young minds. They can be nurtured through training, example, and repetition, making them some of the most popular virtues among youth. From an early age, boys were encouraged to emulate these traits, often through tales of military exploits shared even before they were weaned from their mother's care. If a young child cried out in pain, a mother might reprimand him sharply. "What a coward to cry over such a trivial ache! What will you do when your arm is severed in battle, or when you are called upon to commit harakiri?" This stern upbringing fostered remarkable fortitude, exemplified in the story of a young famished prince from Sendai. In a famous drama, he says to his page, "Do you see those tiny sparrows in their nest, how they open their yellow beaks wide, waiting for their mother to bring worms to feed them? How eagerly and joyfully they eat. But for a samurai, it is a disgrace to feel hunger, even when the stomach is empty." Stories of fortitude and bravery like this were abundant in nursery tales, yet they were not the only means of instilling a spirit of daring and fearlessness. Parents often subjected their children to rigorous tasks, sometimes bordering on cruelty, to cultivate resilience. "Bears toss their cubs down the gorge," they would say, and so samurai sons were metaphorically hurled into the steep valleys of hardship and tested with Sisyphean tasks. Children were occasionally deprived of food or exposed to the cold as a means of building endurance. They were sent on errands to distant places among strangers, expected to deliver messages with precision. Rising before the sun, they attended to their reading exercises before breakfast, walking barefoot to their teachers even in the biting cold of winter. Once or twice a month, often on the festival of a deity of learning, small groups of children would gather to spend the night reading aloud in turns, deliberately staying awake until dawn. Pilgrimages to eerie locations, execution grounds, graveyards, or haunted houses were among the favorite activities of young boys. In times when public executions were common, children were not only sent to witness these grim spectacles, but also tasked with visiting the sites alone at night. There, they were required to leave a mark on a severed head, proving their courage. Does this ultra-Spartan approach to nerve training shock the modern educator? Does it provoke doubts about whether such methods might brutalize the spirit, stifling the tender emotions of the heart before they have a chance to bloom? Let us explore in the next chapter how Bushido further defined and refined its concept of valor. Chapter 5. Benevolence, the feeling of distress. Love, magnanimity, affection for others, sympathy and pity. These were always regarded as supreme virtues, the highest expressions of the human soul. Benevolence was considered a princely virtue in two senses: princely among the many qualities of a noble spirit, and princely as especially fitting for those in a position of rulership. While we may not have needed Shakespeare to feel this truth, perhaps like the rest of the world, we needed him to express it. Mercy is above this sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. Confucius and Mencius often emphasized that the highest duty of a ruler lies in benevolence. Confucius declared, "If a prince cultivates virtue, people will flock to him. With people will come land, and with land, wealth. Wealth will then provide the means for righteous uses. Virtue is the root, wealth is its fruit." He also said, "Never has there been a ruler who loved benevolence and did not inspire righteousness among the people." Mencius echoed these sentiments, adding, "There are instances of individuals attaining power in a single state without benevolence, but I have never heard of an entire empire falling into the hands of one who lacked this virtue." He further observed, "It is impossible for anyone to rule the people if they have not yielded their hearts to him." Both sages defined this essential quality in a ruler with the simple yet profound statement, Benevolence is the essence of humanity." Under the feudal system, prone as it was to devolve into militarism, it was benevolence that protected society from descending into the worst forms of despotism. If the governed had surrendered their life and limb entirely, nothing would have remained for the rulers but unchecked self-will, inevitably leading to the absolutism often labeled Oriental despotism. Yet history reminds us that despotism was not unique to the East. The West has seen its share of tyrants as well. I have no intention of defending despotism in any form, but it is a mistake to equate feudalism with tyranny. When Frederick the Great famously declared that kings are the first servants of the state, it marked a new era in the development of freedom. Around the same time, in the remote northwestern region of Japan, Yozan of Yonezawa echoed this sentiment, declaring a similar philosophy. This demonstrates that feudalism was not inherently oppressive. A feudal lord, though he might neglect reciprocal duties toward his vassals, often felt a profound responsibility to his ancestors and to heaven. His role was paternal, as he regarded his subjects as children entrusted to his care by heaven. The ancient Chinese book of poetry states, "Until the house of Yin lost the hearts of the people, they could appear before heaven." Similarly, Confucius taught in his great learning, "When the prince loves what the people love and hates what the people hate, then he is what is called the parent of the people." In this way, public opinion and monarchical authority, or democracy and absolutism, merged harmoniously. Bushido endorsed a paternalistic form of government, which stood in contrast to the more detached, avuncular governance, epitomized, perhaps, by Uncle Sam. The key distinction between a despotic government and a paternal one lies in the nature of obedience. In despotism, obedience is reluctant and resentful. In paternal governance, it is marked by proud submission, dignified obedience, and a subordination of heart that preserves, even in servitude, the spirit of exalted freedom. There is some truth in the old saying that England's monarchs were called kings of devils because their subjects frequently rebelled and deposed them, while French kings were dubbed kings of asses due to the heavy taxes imposed on their people. By contrast, the Spanish sovereigns were known as kings of men for inspiring willing obedience among their subjects. But enough of this comparison. To the Anglo-Saxon mind, virtue and absolute power may seem irreconcilable. Yet, as Pobedonostsev observed, there is a fundamental contrast between the foundations of English society and those of other European communities. English society is built upon the principle of individual independence, while continental nations, particularly among the Slavic peoples, emphasize personal dependence on social alliances and, ultimately, the state. This observation holds doubly true for Japan. As a result, the free exercise of monarchical power does not weigh as heavily on us as it might in Europe. In Japan, it is often tempered by a paternal concern for the people's welfare. As Bismarck once remarked, absolutism primarily demands in the ruler impartiality, honesty, devotion to duty, energy, and inward humility. Similarly, the German emperor at Koblenz described kingship as a divine calling, laden with heavy duties and immense responsibilities, to the Creator alone, from which no man, no minister, and no parliament can absolve the monarch. Benevolence, in our understanding, is a tender maternal virtue. If upright rectitude and stern justice are distinctly masculine traits, then mercy embodies the gentleness and persuasiveness of the feminine spirit. However, we were cautioned against practicing charity indiscriminately, without tempering it with justice and rectitude. Masamune expressed this balance beautifully in his well-known aphorism. Rectitude carried to excess hardens into rigidity. Benevolence indulged beyond measure softens into weakness. Fortunately, mercy, though rare in its ideal form, was celebrated for its profound beauty. It has been said universally that the bravest are the tenderest, the loving are the daring. The phrase, Bushi no Nasake, the tenderness of a warrior, resonates deeply, appealing to the noblest parts of our nature. The mercy of a samurai was not fundamentally different from the mercy of others. What set it apart was its grounding in justice. It was never a blind impulse, but a deliberate act, supported by the power to save or destroy. Just as economists distinguish between effective and ineffective demand, we can distinguish between mercy that is mere sentiment and mercy that is effectual, mercy backed by the power to act for the good or detriment of the recipient. Despite their pride in brute strength and the privileges it afforded, the samurai wholeheartedly embraced Mencius' teachings on the power of love. Mencius wrote, "Benevolence overcomes whatever resists it, just as water extinguishes fire. Only those who attempt to quench a blazing cartload of wood with a mere cup of water doubt the power of water to douse flames." He also declared, "The feeling of distress is the root of benevolence," suggesting that a truly benevolent person is always mindful of those who suffer. Long before Adam Smith grounded his ethical philosophy on sympathy, Mencius had already articulated this principle. It is remarkable how closely the knightly code of one culture aligns with those of others. The much maligned Oriental ideas of morality often find their counterparts in the finest maxims of European literature. If a Japanese gentleman were shown Virgil's famous lines, "These shall be your arts, to impose the habit of peace, to spare the conquered, and to subdue the proud," he might readily accuse the Mantuan poet of borrowing from Japanese traditions. Benevolence toward the weak, the downtrodden, and the vanquished was always celebrated as a virtue befitting a samurai. One legendary tale illustrates this virtue vividly. Lovers of Japanese art may be familiar with depictions of a priest riding backward on a cow, a striking image that originates from the story of a warrior-turned-monk. During the decisive Battle of Sumano-ura in 1184, this warrior, Kumagaye Naozane, caught up with an enemy and engaged him in single combat. According to the etiquette of war, blood was not to be spilled unless the weaker party was of equal rank or ability to the victor. When Kumagaye demanded the name of his adversary, the youth refused. Removing the enemy's helmet, Kumagaye was startled to see the fair, beardless face of a young boy. Overcome with compassion, Kumagaye helped the youth to his feet and said in a paternal tone, "Return to your mother's side, young prince. The sword of Kumagaye shall never be stained with your blood. Hasten and flee across the pass before your enemies arrive." The boy refused, begging Kumagaye to kill him for the sake of their honor. As Kumagaye raised his sword, he thought of his own son, who had marched to battle that same day. His strong hand trembled, and once again he pleaded with the youth to escape. But as the sound of approaching comrades grew louder, Kumagaye realized the boy might meet a crueler fate. He cried out, "If you are captured, you may fall to a more ignoble hand than mine. O infinite spirit, receive his soul." With a swift motion, his sword flashed through the air, and when it fell, it was stained with the blood of the boy. After the war, Kumagaye returned home in triumph, but honor and fame now meant little to him. Haunted by the memory of the young warrior, he abandoned his military career, shaved his head, and donned the robes of a monk. For the rest of his life, he devoted himself to spiritual pursuits, always facing west, where paradise lay and where the sun made its daily descent. Critics may highlight inconsistencies or moral dilemmas in the tale of Kumagaye, calling it vulnerable to casuistry. Let them. The story remains a powerful testament to the tenderness, pity, and love that could shine even amid the bloodiest deeds of a samurai. An old maxim among these warriors declared, "It becometh not the fowler to slay the bird that takes refuge in his bosom." Such sentiments help explain why the Red Cross movement, often considered uniquely Christian, found such a natural home in Japan. Decades before the Geneva Convention became known to us, Bakin, one of our greatest novelists, wrote about the medical care of fallen foes, embedding this concept in the cultural consciousness. In the Principality of Satsuma, renowned for its martial discipline and education, young samurai were encouraged to practice music, not the brash sounds of trumpets or drums, those clamorous harbingers of blood and death that stir the tiger's ferocity, but the gentle, melancholic melodies of the biwa. These soothing strains calmed fiery spirits, steering thoughts away from the scent of blood and the chaos of battle. This practice parallels the tradition in Arcadia, as described by the historian Polybius. The Arcadian constitution required all youths under 30 to learn music, believing its gentle influence could soften the harshness of their mountainous climate. Polybius attributed the absence of cruelty among the people of Arcadia to this cultivation of art. Gentleness, however, was not exclusive to Satsuma. Across Japan, samurai were taught to temper their strength with kindness. A prince of Shirakawa recorded his musings, including this reflection. "Though they come stealing to your bedside in the silent watches of the night, drive them not away, but rather cherish them. The fragrance of flowers, the sound of distant bells, the insect hum of a frosty night." Elsewhere he wrote, "Though they may wound your feelings, forgive these three: the breeze that scatters your flowers, the cloud that obscures your moon, and the man who seeks to provoke you." The writing of poetry was ostensibly a way to express gentler emotions, but in truth, it was also a means to cultivate them. As a result, Japanese poetry carries a deep undercurrent of pathos and tenderness. A well-known anecdote of a rustic samurai highlights this practice. When instructed to learn versification, his first assignment was to write on the warbler's notes. His fiery, warlike spirit rebelled, and he scornfully flung this crude attempt at his teacher's feet. "The brave warrior keeps apart, the ear that might listen to the warbler's song." Undeterred by this unrefined sentiment, his teacher persisted in encouraging him. Over time, the samurai's soul began to resonate with the delicate beauty of the Ugisu's song, and eventually, He composed this verse. Stands the warrior, mailed and strong, to hear the ugisu's song, warbled sweet the trees among. This transformation reflects the power of poetry to awaken tenderness in even the most hardened hearts. The heroic moment in Kerner's short life, when, wounded on the battlefield, he scribbled his famous farewell to life, is admired throughout the world. Yet similar incidents were not uncommon in Japan's own history. Our compact epigrammatic poems were well suited to capturing singular sentiments. It was not unusual for a marching soldier to halt, retrieve writing tools from his belt, and compose an ode. Later, these scraps of paper were often discovered tucked inside the helmets or breastplates of fallen warriors. Just as Christianity in Europe has inspired compassion amidst the horrors of war, Japan found similar solace in the love of music and literature. The cultivation of tender feelings fosters a deep regard for the suffering of others. From this sensibility arises modesty and courtesy, rooted in respect for the emotions of others. These virtues form the very foundation of Japanese politeness. Chapter 6. Politeness. Courtesy and refinement of manners have been noted by every foreign visitor as a defining characteristic of the Japanese. However, politeness is a shallow virtue if motivated solely by the fear of offending good taste. True politeness should instead be the outward expression of a genuine, sympathetic regard for the feelings of others. It also implies an awareness of the fitness of things, including a respectful acknowledgement of social positions, not as symbols of wealth or privilege, but as markers of merit and accomplishment. In its highest form, politeness borders on love. We might even describe it with reverence, using the words, "Politeness suffereth long and is kind, envieth not, vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, taketh no account of evil." Is it any wonder that Professor Dean, in discussing the 6 essential elements of humanity, assigns politeness an exalted position? He regards it as the finest fruit of social interaction. While I extol the value of politeness, I do not place it among the highest virtues. Upon closer examination, we see that it is deeply interconnected with virtues of a higher order. Indeed, no virtue stands alone. Politeness in particular was elevated within the samurai profession, often being valued more than it deserved. This overemphasis gave rise to counterfeits of true politeness. Confucius himself repeatedly taught that outward appearances are no more an intrinsic part of true propriety than mere sounds are of music. When propriety became a cornerstone of social interaction, it was only natural for an elaborate system of etiquette to emerge, training youth in the art of correct behavior. Instructions on how to bow, walk, and sit were taught with meticulous care. Table manners evolved into a science, and the act of serving and drinking tea was elevated to a ceremonial art. A man of education was, of course, expected to master all these skills. In his fascinating book, Mr. Veblen aptly refers to decorum as a product and an exponent of the leisure class life. I've heard Europeans criticize our elaborate discipline of politeness, dismissing it as excessive and frivolous. While I acknowledge that some ceremonious details might seem unnecessary, I question whether they are any more foolish than the constantly changing fashions of the West. To my mind, even fashions are not merely whims of vanity. They reflect humanity's ceaseless pursuit of beauty. Similarly, I do not regard elaborate ceremonies as entirely trivial. On the contrary, they represent the result of long observation and careful refinement to determine the most appropriate methods for achieving specific goals. If something is worth doing, there is surely a best way to do it, one that is both efficient and graceful. As Mr. Spencer notes, grace is the most economical manner of motion. For example, the tea ceremony prescribes precise movements for handling a bowl, spoon, napkin, and other tools. To a novice, these procedures may appear tedious. However, with practice, one realizes that the prescribed methods are, in fact, the most efficient, saving both time and effort. In other words, they embody the most economical use of energy and, by Spencer's definition, the most graceful. The spiritual significance of social decorum, or to borrow from the philosophy of clothes, the spiritual discipline that etiquette and ceremony merely cloak, is far greater than their outward appearances suggest. I might follow Mr. Spencer's example and trace the origins of our ceremonial practices and the moral principles that inspired them, but that is not my intention here. Instead, I wish to emphasize the moral training embedded in the strict observance of propriety. As I have mentioned, etiquette was refined to an extraordinary degree, giving rise to various schools of thought, each advocating its own system. Yet, all these schools shared a common ultimate goal, which was best articulated by a master of the Ogasawara school, the most renowned school of etiquette. The purpose of all etiquette is to cultivate your mind so thoroughly that even when you are seated quietly, not the roughest ruffian would dare attack you. In other words, through the constant practice of proper manners, one aligns every part of their body and mind into perfect harmony, achieving a state where the spirit's mastery over the flesh is evident. This lends a profound new meaning to the French term bienséance, which signifies propriety and grace. If grace is indeed, as it has been said, the economy of force, it logically follows that the consistent practice of graceful behavior generates a reserve of energy. Fine manners, then, embody power at rest. Consider the barbarian Gauls who, during their sack of Rome, burst into the Senate and dared to pull the beards of the venerable fathers. This act of disrespect could be attributed to the senators' lack of dignity and commanding presence, qualities that should have been expressed through their manners. Can etiquette truly lead to profound spiritual attainment? Why not? After all, as the old saying goes, all roads lead to Rome. As an example of how the simplest act can be elevated into an art form and ultimately become a tool for spiritual cultivation, let us consider Cha no Yu, the tea ceremony. Tea sipping as a fine art. Why not? Just as a child's drawings in the sand or a savage's carvings on stone contained the seeds of a Raphael or a Michelangelo, so too could the act of drinking tea, which originated with the contemplative practices of a Hindu ascetic, evolve into a companion of religion and morality. The calmness of mind, serenity of spirit, and composure of demeanor that Cha no Yu demands are undeniably the foundation of right thinking and feeling. The meticulously clean and minimalist tea room, secluded from the noise and distractions of the outside world, naturally directs one's thoughts inward. Unlike a Western parlor cluttered with countless pictures and ornaments that vie for attention, the simplicity of the tea room centers the mind. A solitary kakemono, a hanging scroll, draws focus to the elegance of its design rather than the richness of its colors, fostering a refined aesthetic sense. The ultimate goal is the cultivation of taste, while any hint of ostentation is rejected with almost religious fervor. The origins of Cha no Yu further underscore its purpose. Invented by a meditative recluse during an era of incessant war and political turmoil, the tea ceremony was far more than a mere diversion. Before stepping into the serene space of the tea room, participants set aside their swords, along with the ferocity of the battlefield or the burdens of governance, finding instead peace and friendship within its quiet precincts. Cha no Yu is more than a ceremony. It is a fine art. It is poetry expressed through deliberate and rhythmic gestures. Most importantly, it is a method of spiritual discipline. While its artistic and ceremonial aspects often took precedence in the minds of its practitioners, these do not diminish its essence as a deeply spiritual practice. Politeness is a valuable trait, even if it only serves to impart grace to manners, yet its purpose extends far beyond this. Propriety, rooted in benevolence and modesty and motivated by a sincere concern for the feelings of others, becomes a graceful expression of sympathy. It teaches us to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. When translated into the small, everyday acts of life, this principle manifests itself in ways that may go unnoticed or, if noticed, may even seem awfully funny, as one missionary lady with 2 decades of experience in Japan once remarked to me. Imagine this: you are standing under the glaring sun without shade, and a Japanese acquaintance passes by. You greet him, and he immediately removes his hat. That's perfectly natural. But then comes the awfully funny part. While conversing with you, he lowers his parasol and stands in the same blazing sun. How foolish! Yes, it might seem so, but only if the motive were less than this. You're in the sun, and I sympathize with your discomfort. If my parasol were large enough, or if we were close enough in our relationship, I would gladly share its shade with you. Since I cannot do that, I will instead share your discomfort. Small acts like this, which might appear amusing or strange, are not mere gestures or empty conventions. They are tangible expressions of thoughtful consideration for others' comfort. Another custom that foreign observers often find awfully funny stems from our codes of politeness. Many superficial writers on Japan dismiss it as an example of the topsy-turviness of Japanese culture. Consider the contrast. In America, when presenting a gift, you praise it to the recipient, emphasizing its value. In Japan, we depreciate or even criticize the gift. The American approach implies, "This is a fine gift. If it were not, I wouldn't dare give it to you, as it would be an insult to offer anything less than excellent." In contrast, the Japanese reasoning is, "You are a person of great worth, and no gift could ever be good enough for you. Please accept this not for its intrinsic value, but as a token of my goodwill. It would insult your worth to suggest that even the finest gift is sufficient for someone like you." When we place these two perspectives side by side, it becomes clear that their underlying essence is the same. Neither is awfully funny. The American emphasizes the material quality of the gift, while the Japanese focuses on the spirit behind the act of giving. It is flawed reasoning to judge the principle of propriety by focusing on its smallest expressions and holding them up as representative of the whole. Consider the question, which is more important, eating or observing the rules of propriety about eating? A Chinese sage provides an answer. If you compare a situation where eating is essential and observing propriety is of little importance, then of course eating takes precedence. But does that mean propriety itself is unimportant? Similarly, the statement, "metal is heavier than feathers," is true, but it hardly applies if we compare a single clasp of metal to a wagon load of feathers. Likewise, raising a wooden beam a foot thick above the pinnacle of a temple does not make the beam taller than the temple itself. Context matters. To the question, which is more important, to tell the truth or to be polite? It is said that the Japanese and Americans give opposite answers. However, I will refrain from commenting further until I discuss the topics of veracity and sincerity in a later chapter.